So is everybody settled in? Have water, drinks, whatever, ready to go? So my name is Chris Sperling. I am the Historic Preservation Planner for Calvert County. Many of you may have known Kirsty, and she retired, and I was fortunate enough to move into her position. So I work at Calvert County government. Kind of a little bit of a background, at least on this. First off, February is Black History Month, and so I thought this was a really good time to do this presentation. I've been working on this research off and on since I started in this role, and one of the things I find it's important when working in a locality is finding topics that are relevant and important to the locality, something that the community is interested in. And so when I first took this position, I started looking around, and I saw that the U.S. colored troops was a subject that the Historical Society was already working on, and that my predecessor had worked on and started with. And I said early on in my career I would never work Civil War, because people always know more than you do, right? All the information is out there, and somebody, you kind of start in on it, and all of a sudden you're talking with people who have spent their entire lifetimes researching it. So with a bit of trepidation, I took on this to continue this project. So I want to look at the United States colored troops from Calvert County. I'll give a little bit of background. I think it'll be helpful if you're not familiar with a little bit of Civil War history to give the big context, and then a little bit, and then bring it here to home. So if we look at the election of 1860, of course, we all know that this is the election where Abraham Lincoln was elected. But if we look at the map, first thing that automatically pops out is we're a seriously divided country in 1860, with almost every southern state, including the state of Maryland, going for the Southern Democrat candidate Breckinridge, almost all the northern states going for the Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln. If we look at the results of the election, the electoral vote is overwhelming, 59%. When have we last seen 59% electoral vote? But the devil's in the details. He took 40% of the popular vote, which means entering into the office, he has 60% of the population that did not vote for him to be in the office that he's holding. The deepest of the southern states were convinced that with Lincoln taking office, he was going to abolish slavery. And almost immediately after his election, we see the first wave of states seceding and forming what we would come to know as the Confederacy. And those are the ones that are marked in deep red. In my job, we look at a lot of revisionist history, and I like to look at the documents. What did the people at the time have to say? And one of the things that we find out is many of these states, kind of an American tradition we took from the British, documented why. And about 5 or 6 of these states wrote up articles of secession and passed them resolutions through their state legislatures. And if we look at South Carolina's, it's really long and flowery. It's lots of, grandiose talk about liberty and so on and so forth. And then when you kind of read into it, it says, and they're going to take away the slaves. Texas doesn't even bother with any of that. It cuts right to the chase. We're ducking out of here because Lincoln's going to take away our slaves. So we get to the action at Fort Sumter, where the federal government decides to resupply. The Confederates open fire, what most consider to be the opening major volleys of the Civil War. As a result of this action, President Lincoln calls up for troops, for volunteers to fight this war. 90-day men, 100,000, 80,000, 90,000, 75,000, thanks. Here we come, Father Abraham, 75,000 strong, I think, something like that. And because of this, because of the call-up of troops, then we see the second wave of secession, and that's the light red. So a lot of those states that have been kind of right in between, including Virginia, the border states, the ones that are right sandwiched in between, here colored in yellow. Civil War went on for the first 2 years, and what they had originally thought was going to be a really fast war. If we look at the memories from the original battle, the battle of First Manassas, First Bull Run, people came out from Washington, D.C. to watch it in picnics. because this was going to be this great battle, the only battle of the Civil War. After this, everything would be done. And then all of a sudden, everything went the other way. And then for another year after that, most victories were going towards the southern side. And unsuspectedly, the North was not doing all that well. We get to September 1862, and what we see here, that's Burnside's bridge at the Battle of Sharpsburg, Battle of Antietam, September 17th, 18th. I should know this. It's actually my code. So if I pull out my phone, I can sit there and type it, and I'll get bloodiest day in American history to this day, bloodiest single day. Gettysburg, the bloodiest battle of American history, but it's 3 days long. Sharpsburg, 1 day, bloodiest day in American history. It's basically a stalemate. Both armies leave the field, but Lee left the field, which allowed the Union to effectively treat it like a victory. The South had been purged from Maryland and had retreated back into Virginia. Lincoln uses this opportunity a few months later as public sentiment is getting a little bit better, but still not good, and issues the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, we're relatively familiar with the meat of it, the big part. And by virtue of the power and for the purpose of purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are and henceforth shall be free. Another thing that he did in the Emancipation Proclamation that gets a little bit less attention, and such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed services of the United States. In other words, another action of the Emancipation Proclamation is to declare that African Americans could be accepted into the U.S. military. However, it's not until General Orders 143 in May 22nd, 63, that we get the first line, the opening line of the orders. A bureau is established in the Adjutant General's office for the record of all matters relating to the organization of colored troops. Anybody here who's worked in government knows first you have the act, the enabling legislation or enabling action, and now we actually have to have the legalese that sets up the structure for it. Now we actually have a structure to create United States colored troops within the United States Army. So, after the formation of the United States troops, by the end of the war, 185,000 African American men will volunteer for the Union Army, representing 10% of all volunteers in the Union Army. Leaders would later say that winning the war was impossible without African American troops. Of that number, 8,718 came from the state of Maryland. And in research that I've been able to do, I took a list that, that somebody else had done, looking at persons from Calvert County. And I'm guessing that they did it in the good old days when you had to go to the archives and look. I was able to run it through Ancestry, and I was able to enhance that list from about, I think, 150 to now over, here we go, over 300 individuals from Calvert County. And my expanse for that was if their cards said that they had, were enlisted in Calvert, if they were born in Calvert. We have many that volunteer in other jurisdictions. But we're said to, and my philosophy behind that was, if you were born in Calvert, you're from Calvert. Some of these are a little bit difficult, where when you trace them and when they come back, they're actually in southern, but I'm running with the number 300, 300 plus. And I started looking through their records. So, of course, I think what a lot of people know, and the most famous action in which African American troops took part during the Civil War, was the storming of Fort Wagner in South Carolina. Of course, we know this, the 54th Massachusetts. I believe 2 of Frederick Douglass's sons. We, of course, know it because it was immortalized in the movie Glory, which to me still remains one of my favorite movies. I actually really like this movie. I allow my students, rather than doing a topic of public history, they can instead watch this and do an assessment of it to say where it works. So, but that was not the only action, and again, I wanted to be locally focused. So what I started doing was looking at the units, because there was only a handful, 10, 12 regiments, to which Calvert County African Americans volunteered. And I looked through those unit histories and plotted out the battles in which they took part. And if we look at the map here, I've plotted those out. So obviously a lot in Northern Virginia, but then also we're looking at North Carolina. We actually had a Calvert County man who was captured in North Carolina and died as a prisoner of war. I don't want to imagine what that must have been like. But then South Carolina and also actions in Florida. I want to take a real brief second here because I'm not a military historian. My background is archaeology, and that makes me kind of more social, cultural. So I have to go looking at this stuff. I have to get my head around sizes of numbers, how things are organized. And anybody here who's watched documentaries, I watch a lot, especially on the Civil War, you start hearing about this general's right and this general's left, and nobody knows what that means. And regiments this and brigades that and armies this. Let's just break it down and show how armies were organized. So when we talk about an army during the Civil War, we're talking about a geographic area. Army of Northern Virginia, Army of the Potomac. So if we break down an army, what an army is made of is usually between 2 and 5 corps, right? That's the next smaller unit is going to be a corps. So each corps is comprised of at least 2, usually between 2 and 5 divisions. Each division is comprised of between 2 and 5 brigades. Each brigade is comprised of usually 4, maybe 5 regiments. And what's a regiment? A regiment is 1,000 of these. So now multiply that out. And you can kind of get the idea. So when we're talking in the Civil War, we're talking about, if we're looking at the Revolution and we're looking at the size of armies during the Revolution, the Civil War is huge. The number of combatants in the Revolutionary War, you could have a battle that was 10,000 combatants on each side. That would be a skirmish by Civil War standards. In the Civil War, we're talking about 100, 125 combatants on each side. The battle for which the United States colored troops are probably best known is Petersburg, and specifically what's referred to as the Battle of the Crater in Petersburg. And just to give a little bit of background on what that was, how the battle went. The Union Army was making its way towards Richmond. It reached Petersburg. There, the Confederate Army managed to stop the Union Army, and both sides dug in. And it became this deadlocked situation, stalemate, for several months. And the lines were hardened. These were really, really strong earthenwork forts. On the Union side, to break the stalemate, a lieutenant colonel from Western Pennsylvania, and I always tell my students, what's Western Pennsylvania known for? Because my wife's family are from there. What the necessary component of steel, or coal mining. Yeah, her grandfather, after coming back from World War II, was a coal miner his whole life. After he passed, the Coal Miners Union kept my wife's grandmother, good for the rest of her life. So coal miners know how to dig, right? Coal miners know mines. And so that was their solution. They came up with this idea, and he says, look, I can tunnel in underneath this big Confederate fort. I'm going to build this room. I'm going to pack it with a bunch of gunpowder. We'll set the fuse, and we'll blow it up. It's going to create this void that we can rush through. This is a great idea. Miner knows mines, miner knows explosions. He says there are 2 problems that you got to work through with this. First off, when that thing goes up, it's going to be dust everywhere. You're going to be absolute confusion. You're not going to be able to see. You can't let it settle. By the time the dust settles, the Confederates will have time to reorganize, and if you wait, it's murder. Sorry? Right. That was the other problem. It's going to create a big crater. The crater that this eventually creates is about 150 feet long, 100 feet wide, 30 feet deep. Okay. And you won't see it because everything is covered in dust. So they said, the other part is you're going to have the void, and there's going to be a big ditch, but you can go around the sides. You go around the sides, you can charge right through, you'll penetrate the fort, your troops are going to be behind the lines. This is how we're going to win this. You're going to need to train a unit. You're going to need to train a unit that knows this, that knows exactly what to do. So They chose, I believe it was 2 regiments, 3 regiments of United States colored troops, including troops from Calvert County, and they specifically trained them for 2 weeks out of sight of the Confederates, so the Confederates would have no clue what was going on. And they drilled them for 2 weeks, make sure they knew exactly what the situation was going to be when that went up. So, night before, they go to the commanding officer, General Meade, and he says, "Do you have your plan ready?" He says, "Yes, sir." He says, "Who's going to lead the charge?" And he said, "Well, we've trained the United States colored troops to go through." Meade says, "Hold on a second here. This is a risky plan. If anything goes wrong, those troops are going to get slaughtered. Imagine the public relations fiasco if it looks like we are sending in these African American troops to the slaughter." So the night before it goes off, literally the night before that room gets exploded, General Meade orders another unit to be chosen for the assault. They chose the unit by taking the division commanders and giving them straws to pull. The short straw was drawn by the most understrength division in the entire Army. It was weaker than any other division, and they had already had a reputation for poor conduct in battle. In a previous battle, only a few days earlier, the commander had actually been caught retreating back behind the lines to hide. So, 4:44 in the morning, boom, it goes off. What happens? They were never trained. They waited for the dust to settle. The dust begins to settle. By the time the dust settles, there was no Confederates on the fortification for 15 minutes. It took over 10 before the first Union troops came across, untrained. What did they do? They charged right down the middle. They found themselves in the crater. And at first they thought, this is great. This gives us a nice little pit that we can fire from. Except they're 30 foot down. They can't crawl out of it. The Confederates are another 20 foot above the ground, 50 foot above, firing directly in. Confederates would later describe this as a turkey shoot. Behind this, they would send the United States colored troops that were going to go in. And we can see here, there I circled it, USCT. Basically an entire division, 2 brigades of United States colored troops were then sent in behind, the ones who had been trained. General Meade ordered the attack to be called off. It was General Burnside, a subordinate commander, who said, "I think we can still make this work." Disobeyed orders, sent in the United States colored troops. They're going into already a battle, a slaughter that's already in progress, and they're coming in behind in absolute confusion. A few members of the United States colored troops did manage to penetrate the lines and get into the trenches. And there they came across another problem. Remember, Confederates did not recognize African American troops as soldiers. For that matter, they didn't recognize them as people. And so the orders that they were under was not to take African Americans as prisoner. If they were taken alive, they were to be returned to slavery. And that's if they were taken alive. And as you can see here, all of these are Calvert County men who died at the Battle of the Crater. What amazes me, too, and what I appreciate as someone working within the community, is if you look at some of the names, we recognize those names, don't we? Right? Carroll, Coates. Coates I think of as kind of Prince George's. Gray, Freeland. Right? These are names that we still know today. Like I said, African American troops encountered additional difficulties. This is taken from a letter that was sent by the Confederate artillery commander. "I think over 200 Negroes got into our lines by surrendering and running in. I don't believe that much over half of these ever reached the rear." He then continues. "As soon as we got upon them, they threw down their weapons in surrender, but were not allowed to do so. Every bomb-proof I saw had 1 or 2 dead Negroes in it who had sulked out of the fight and been found and killed by our men." This is a first-hand account, individuals who were there. A researcher actually looked at this, found a couple different quotes. He thinks he's identified about 4 separate massacres that happened that day. And one of his points of proof, and it's content, there are people who disagree with his analysis. That's fine. One of the things he did, and I have not done here, is he looked at the ratio of killed to wounded. It's much more common to be wounded than it is to be killed. During the Civil War, I think the ratio was something like 1 killed for every 4 or 6 wounded. For African American troops at the crater, that was 1 to 1.7. Statistically, it doesn't work out. Moving forward, we get to Appomattox. Right? This is when General Lee surrenders his army to General Grant. Although it's not officially the end of the Civil War, it's the last major Confederate army in the field to surrender. Effectively, this is the end of the Civil War. United States colored troops from Calvert County were present at the surrender, at Lee's surrender to Grant. Where they were not present, the Grand Review of the Armies. After the war, the armies paraded for 2 or 3 days in Washington, D.C., in this masterful review of the armies that had just won this amazing Civil War. There were no African-American units in it. Most of the African-American units that included troops from Calvert County were already sent to the Department of Texas, where they were sent to the border. That's Galveston, right during the Civil War. And they found themselves in remote outposts along the Rio Grande River, kind of like this. This is a bit of a grainy one, but kind of gives you the idea of the vast open expanses. This is a slightly better picture. Although those are not colored troops, that is one of the forts that U.S. colored troops were stationed at in Texas. And this is where they finished out their service. Usually 1866, 1867, they finished their service, and then they started making their way home. One of the places that they came, left Texas, and many went to New Orleans for final transport back to the north. Just because the war was over didn't mean that the dying was over. All of these are Calvert County men who died while they were stationed in Texas, mostly of disease. One of the things I'd like you to notice, if you remember the Petersburg graphic, if this looks like the names are smaller, but there are more of them, it's because there are. More Calvert County men died primarily of disease in Texas than were killed at the Battle of Petersburg. And also, you look at the causes of death. We see a lot unknown. We still see gunshot wounds, accidental, non-accidental. One of those gunshot wounds, the medical report says killed by an assassin. But by and large, the greatest cause of death, which was the greatest cause of death during the Civil War on both sides among all troops, is disease. And you can see there was a cholera outbreak in particular. Again, looking at the family names, one of the family names that still remains really big in Calvert County, Gross. And the two there that I think are, they're both 9th United States colored troops, both die of cholera. Makes me wonder if they're not related, and they probably may have communicated it to each other. So many of these troops end up in transit in New Orleans in 1866. In June, I believe, 1866, there were riots in New Orleans because that included United States colored troops. The United States colored troops were going through the town and were demonstrating for the right to vote. They were met by an angry mob, and a massacre took place in the streets of New Orleans. As far as I can tell, we do not have any Calvert County United States colored troops who were there at that time. However, there were, I believe, at least 2 that I came across that were arrested in 1866 in New Orleans by the local authorities. And at least one of them was what we call a non-commissioned officer. So in the military at the time, they would not allow African Americans to be officers, commissioned officers, lieutenant, captains, colonels, and so forth. But they were allowed to assume the non-commissioned officers. People who are in the military will always say the ones who actually do all the work, right? Your corporals, your sergeants, the ones who are the kind of heart of the corps of soldiers, right? I can only imagine what it must have been like for an African American with stripes in his sleeves and authority to be in New Orleans in post-war, just months after there had been race riots. So I don't know the specifics about the detention, but we do know that they were detained. this also made me, and I tell you, I listen to a lot of documentaries. I came across one, and I came across a line, and when I heard it, this is only a couple days ago, I heard it, and I'm like, I got to use that. So I immediately put it in the slide. In America, I was free only in battle, never free to rest. And he who finds no way to rest cannot long survive the battle. Isn't that a great one? That's James Baldwin. So it's much, much later, and it's not, but I thought, even though the context is different, I thought the words really were appropriate for. The battle didn't end when the war did. So from New Orleans, I decided to try to track these individuals. So what happened when they came back? Everybody focuses on these battlefield exploits, on the bravery, on the fighting, on the what happened to them afterwards. Harder to find out than you'd think. But there are a lot of documents if you look close enough. Some of those documents include the Freedmen's Bureau documents. And in this case, it's literally just a Freedmen's Bureau report, a report where people are coming in and they say, well, we've received additional evidence to help support this person's pension claim. But one of the things they do on many of these forms is they put the name, the unit that the soldier served in, and their current residence. Right. So here I've taken the example of Plato Gross. Plato Gross was living on Rose Street in Baltimore. This is mid-1860s, 1867 probably, from the Freedmen's Bureau. And then we find Plato Gross again in the 1890 Veterans Census, still also living in Baltimore. For those I was able to trace after the war, most frequently they would return and take up residence in the city of Baltimore. I can understand why. You have competing draws here. Baltimore would have had an urban setting, would have had jobs, opportunities that these individuals who by and large had came from enslavement before the war, well, maybe they're not going to have maybe the idea of coming back to Calvert County and going back to work in the tobacco fields was not their idea of what they wanted to do. So for a number of them, they resettled in Baltimore. And we can tell a little bit about their lives. That's why I'm not a military historian, because that's what I'm interested in. How did people live? What motivates them? What are their stories? And what do those stories tell us about the bigger picture? So this is an aerial view of Baltimore, 1869. And I love it because you can zoom in. Actually, I'll take this back really quick. Just to give an idea, African-American soldiers returning from the war settled all over the city. However, there were definite concentrations. So if we see this is the Inner Harbor. And this little thing that you can see right there with big long buildings, that's Camden Station, right, Camden Yards. So the greatest concentration of African-American soldiers from Calvert County that I found was mainly in the area down in here and then closer over into here. By taking this image and then moving in, we can go to what I had next, which gives you a pretty good idea of what their environment was like, right? You can see the urban environment, the alleyways, the housing style, the townhouses and such. Although it's a little bit later, it's still a pretty good bit of evidence. I like to combine this with the Sanborn maps. These are fire insurance maps. So even though they don't have as much artisticness to them, they have a lot more detail. So with this, we can tell the pink is brick. The yellow is wood frame. These are fire insurance maps, so they're concerned with things like water. So you have your utilities that go on the side, number of stories, the type of chimney, sometimes the function of the building. Yes, its construction, what it's fronted of, and openings, windows. So with those two bits of evidence, you could actually reconstruct almost exactly what these houses looked like. And although Baltimore, right around 1890, 1900, went through a big period of renovation, and a lot of these, the houses in which they lived were destroyed, some of them still remain. And so then that also, when you have that, you can compare it to the fire insurance map, you can compare it to now we have good evidence for this is where the person lived, or this is the type of place where they lived, which I think is powerful. Some folks did come back. And this is that the dichotomy, the draw, right? In other words, some folks are not going to want to come back to Calvert County for the reasons that we discussed. However, my background, the topics that I really did draw me were early slavery, early colonial slavery, 17th, early 18th century. And one of the things I discovered through that is oftentimes by the late 1800s, the early 1900s, the African American families that were enslaved had oftentimes been here for generations longer than the families they served. One of the things I did through other research was I traced out where African American individuals were sold. And one of the things that I discovered is that in Southern Maryland, and my focus at the time was Prince George's County, the broader trend was to sell down south. That didn't happen in Southern Maryland. In Southern Maryland, they were basically sold among families. Families sold among families. In other words, at this point, after almost 300 years of enslavement, what you had were mixed families. You had families that had deep roots, multi-generational, extended family roots residing within relatively small distances. So a competing force, I think, was to come back because your family was there, your grandchildren were there, your grandparents were there, your aunts, your uncles, everything you knew in life leading forward was there. And many did come back. And of all the pictures that I have in this I chose pictures of United States colored troops. I do not know of one picture of a Calvert County United States colored troop that's been positively identified. However, this portrait is Albert Gant, who was a United States colored troop from Calvert County. He resided around the Maple Road area. He was in the second United States Colored Light Artillery, making him one of only two. He and one other person were in the light artillery. They're really an anomaly. Almost everybody else were in infantry units that trained at Benedict, but he chose a different path. I don't know how he got there. He volunteered at Fort Monroe. One of the things here, and all you have is the evidence. I really, really want to know the story. How did Albert Gant make it to Fort Monroe from Calvert County to enlist? One of the other individuals was in New England, Connecticut, I believe. And when it said the place of enlistment, I looked at it and I had to look it up. I was like, but place of birth was Calvert County. So a little bit of digging can find a lot of interesting stories. Albert Gant would spend the rest of his life in Calvert County and was one of the more famous residents, actually. This is a newspaper clipping from 1918 or 1919. And we know that because there's a soldiers' luncheon at Island Creek neighborhood held near Brooks Church Wednesday afternoon. We all know Brooks. The soldiers gave where does it say? The colored soldiers who have returned from overseas camps. In other words, these are the African American World War I troops who have now come back. And Albert Gant, an old Civil War veteran, was master of ceremonies, addresses made by State's Attorney Frank Perrin and Arthur W. Dow. Of course, names that we still recognize to this day for Calvert County. When they came back, they established a lot of the institutions that we still know today. And the two that I've highlighted here, Mount Hope in Owings, I think we're Owings, Sunderland, we know that one. I was lucky enough, I had to tweak this, but I really like the picture with the sun coming around the steeple. I think that's one of the cutest little country churches ever. And I knew that with the founder, Lemuel Thomas, he was a United States colored troop that founded it. And when I looked and it showed his grave site and his marker, and he had one of the classic little old markers, and I walked all over the cemetery looking for this marker, and I couldn't find it, right? And so I was really disappointed, and I got into my truck, and then I looked over and I saw this disturbed piece of land with a brand new, beautiful, large marker right there. Like first thing you would see as you come in. And of course, my eye was not looking for that. It was looking for an old little one. And the congregation had recently replaced his marker and had a new one installed. They actually have an annual Lemuel Thomas Day. So I really appreciate a community in which we have these individuals that served their country, came back, established these institutions which we still remain today. and we still celebrate. A little closer to here, Brown, United Methodist on Port Republic. That's on Parkers Creek Road. It is in the process. They're starting to work towards rehabilitating it, renovating it, and the goal is to be developed into a multicultural heritage center, which I think will be a really nice addition. Perhaps more importantly, most of these churches also included educational elements. And we have deeds going from 1867, 68 of individuals selling usually 1 acre, 1.5 acre parcels of land for the use of a colored church. Wallville was a slightly later church, but I like to use this example because here it is, probably in the 70s. It was restored, and you might know it is actually now in the school, the high school, Calvert Elementary, and it's part of the curriculum, I believe, for every 7th or 8th grade student. 7th grade student goes through there and does a tour. So that's the success story. There were a number of these. A number of these were established throughout the county. And staffed with African-American teachers, many who came from different areas. I've been able to identify some kind of famous ones. I'm trying to remember some of their stories right now, but these were some of these folks were the same ones who they rubbed elbows with Frederick Douglass. Yeah. Let's just say that not everyone was enthusiastic about the notion of African-American education in Calvert County immediately after the Civil War. And we can intuit this, but we actually have it written. And here we have these monthly reports from the teachers. This one here is from Parkers Creek. The teacher is Carrie Cummings. She and her sister taught all over the Mid-Atlantic. And I like what she has to say about it. State the public sentiment towards colored schools. And she simply says, indifferent. Did I circle that? No. That said, indifferent is an improvement over about 6 months earlier. About 6 months earlier at Asbury, which is a little bit further south, state the sentiment towards colored schools. Not favorable in a single instance. That said, if you actually, as you go through these, there are some, it kind of goes through not favorable or even hostile, I've seen, to indifferent, which lasts a really long time, to, there's some that says something like beginning to accept. So you do see a progression. That said, it obviously was not easy, and the system really didn't help. It was mostly the African-American communities themselves which raised money. There was an account from, I believe, 1867, 1868, where there was a 2-day fair in Prince Frederick, where the African-American community, and you have to remember, this is largely a community that had been enslaved, 2 years after enslavement, is able to raise the money to construct and build the school. And then there are the outliers. So we have the folks who went to Baltimore for a different life, the folks who came back to their roots in Calvert County, and then we had ones that I think imagine being in Little Calvert County during the Civil War, and then all of a sudden you're thrust into this massive endeavor, right? This nationwide endeavor, seeing parts of the country that you've never seen before, and then you come back to Baltimore. And in this case, the individual's name was Benjamin Kelson, and he was working as a laborer for a couple years in Baltimore, and I think he just kind of got wanderlust, right? All of a sudden, he had been exposed to more, and he decided he wanted to go see more. So after a few years between after the war, of being in Baltimore, he enlisted in the 10th Cavalry, and we always know the 10th Cavalry famously as one of the Buffalo Soldier regiments. And he stayed out there. Because one of the other things I wanted to do, the last thing I wanted to do as part of this project, let's identify the people, one. Let's tell their Civil War story. Where did they go? What did they experience? Who made the ultimate sacrifice? Right? Who died? What were their activities? What happened to them? Some of the saddest, I have to say, are there's a surprising, maybe not surprising, number of individuals who die within a month or two of enlisting. In other words, they leave slavery, they go to Benedict, and then they die within a month or two at Benedict. So once we know who they are, once we know what they did during the war, where did they go after the war? What's their story after the war? What communities did they create? So on and so forth. And then the final thing, because I'm thinking, you see the Grosses, you see these other family names, these folks are still here. I have a job, I work for you, right? I need to give something back to you. So, well, what can I give back? Some of the stories, but how about something more tangible? What if you are one of these folks and you find that you're a descendant and you know that your great-great-great-grandfather's name, you can find out what they did. Ultimately, what I'd like to do is find all of their burial places. I will never find all their burial places. I've found probably less than 30, 35%. Most of them are just not known. Benjamin Kelson, who joined the Buffalo Soldiers in the West, he's buried at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Yeah, right? I'd love that little. By and large, the vast majority that I've been able to identify are buried at the Loudon National Cemetery in Baltimore, which makes a lot of sense, right? They were entitled to a national cemetery burial, and that was the largest in Baltimore. And here we see a number of the graves of Calvert County soldiers from the Civil War there. We have a number in our community. Brooks United Methodist, Brown, Lemuel Thomas at Mount Hope. A couple of United States colored troops are buried at Patuxent. But because they died in service, many died in service, they're buried at cemeteries across the country. And so we have here New Bern, North Carolina, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Chalmette, Louisiana. Those are all Calvert County men. And what I've done is try to then map this out. You saw the map with the battles. This is the companion map, which is burial places. And you can see the soldiers who died in Texas. Now, this is a sad story. Soldiers who died in Texas, if you look at the reports, it says buried in the post hospital. I literally called the historic commissions in those counties in Texas and said, I'm working on this, what do you know about it? It turns out that General Services, Federal General Services came down about 1900 or so, excavated all of them out, and then transported them. And he says, but we have a list, and he sent me the list. I had a list. Let's compare lists. I had a list of about 15, well, you saw the list, 15, 20 individuals who died and were buried at the post hospital. I was able to find 2 where they actually recorded moving them. Now, what are the circumstances behind that? Is it latent racism? Sure, in the 1900s, very likely. It doesn't matter. It shouldn't have mattered then. These were still individuals who had given their life for their in service of their country and were being moved from one federal facility to another federal facility. That said, I can only positively account for 2 in San Antonio that were moved to the National Cemetery at San Antonio from these small posts along the Rio Grande. Of course, Benjamin Kelson, the ones at Chalmette, Louisiana. And then you can see that large cluster right around the greater DC area, which is, again, not unexpected. A lot of those are actually in Petersburg. We have Calvert County soldiers buried in Petersburg. So with that, as far as future directions, I don't want to get too much. I was kind of hoping I'd be able to give you a little demo. Unfortunately, I have put all of this information into a website. So the website includes a basic background of United States colored troops from Calvert. It includes the names, and I have it organized by unit and then alphabetical within unit. So you can follow that and you could find the soldier. It's not as whiz-bang yet as I had hoped, but then you can take that. The table also includes if we know the burial location, and then there's a companion to that, which if you go to the burial sites, you'll actually find a map where it will show you, it's this cemetery, this is where it is in the country, and if you wanted to actually get directions to it. So I'm hoping and in my mind, if one person finds a relative of theirs on there, even if they just find it, even if they never do anything with it, that will be worth all the time that I have spent. Hopefully you all agree. But I wanted to be able to show you a little demo of that. Unfortunately, we work for government, so everything has to be approved. And I wait, as late as today, I wait. I'm like, should I just do this? And then I remembered I'm on camera. And so, so once it works its way through the approval process and it's okay to go out as an official site, hopefully then we'll be able to get that up and those tools will be there. And my goal is to have that to be additive, because the other part about getting information out is not altruistic at all. It's about getting more information in, because I am absolutely convinced that there are families in this county who know stories that the documents are not telling me. And so if this in any way ever inspires them so that I can get that, have it for posterity to return back to the county, that would be the greatest gift for me. So with that, I just want to say thank you. I really appreciate you letting me come and talk today. Does anybody have any questions, comments, thoughts?